The auction hammer came down with a sound like a gunshot, and Anna Holloway felt the last piece of her old life shatter into dust. Sold. The Holloway property, all 40 acres in the farmhouse, to Mr. Gerald Finch for the sum of $320. Anna stood at the back of the gathered crowd in Millhaven, Ohio, her black mourning dress heavy with the June heat, her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white as bone. $320. That was what 12 years of marriage, 12 years of breaking her back on that Ohio clay, 12 years of hope and heartbreak and 2 miscarriages and 1 tiny grave in the corner of the property near the old elm tree, that was what all of it amounted to in the end. She did not cry. She had cried enough. The tears had run dry somewhere between the morning she found Thomas cold in their bed and the afternoon she discovered the debts he had hidden from her. Debts that had consumed everything. The cattle sold first, the farm equipment sold second. The furniture, the silver candlesticks her mother had given her, the good china she had never once used because Thomas always said they were saving it for a special occasion that never came. All of it gone to pay what her husband had owed to men whose names she had never heard. Gerald Finch tipped his hat to her as he pushed through the crowd, and she felt a wave of something so dark and so total that it frightened her. Not grief, not anger, something colder, something that tasted like the end of a road. She had $320, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses and a Bible and a photograph of her mother, and a newspaper clipping she had been carrying for 3 weeks, folded and refolded until the creases were almost through the paper. The clipping was from the Kansas City Gazette, dated May 14, 1878. It read in part, "Homestead claims still available in Barrow County, Kansas. Fertile land along the Cimarron River. Settlers wanted. The frontier rewards the bold." Bold. Anna Holloway had never in her life thought of herself as bold. She had been careful, dutiful, obedient. She had trusted Thomas to manage the money because that was what a wife did, and that trust had left her with nothing but a carpet bag and a newspaper clipping, and a grave she would have to leave behind. She made a decision, standing there in the summer heat while Gerald Finch shook hands with the auctioneer. She turned away from the farm she had loved, from the elm tree and the little grave beneath it, and she walked to the railroad station. She did not look back. If she looked back, she would not be able to do what needed to be done. She bought a ticket to Dodge City, Kansas, one way, because there was no going back. The train ride took 3 days, and Anna spent most of it watching the landscape change. Ohio fell away behind her in layers, the green hills giving way to flatter land, the dense forests thinning to scattered copses, and then the great flat expanse of the prairie opening up like a held breath finally released. She had never seen so much sky in her life. It pressed down on the land from every direction, vast and indifferent, and she found it both terrifying and oddly comforting. The sky did not know her name. It had no opinion of her failure or her grief. It simply was. She arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, in July of 1878, stepping off the train into a wall of dry heat that was nothing like the humid summer she had left behind in Ohio. The town was louder than she had expected, the main street a chaos of cattle drives moving through, cowboys on horseback, merchants hawking their wares from storefronts with painted signs, and the distant sound of piano music drifting from a saloon even at 11 in the morning. She found a room at the Dodge City boarding house run by a Mrs. Carver, a broad, efficient woman who charged 50 cents a night and included breakfast and asked no questions. Anna was grateful for that. She spent 2 days gathering information about the Barrow County homestead claims, talking to land agents and settlers who had already made the journey south toward the Cimarron. What she learned was that the land there was good, genuinely good, some of it, with access to river water and deep grass that came back every spring. What she also learned was that going alone, a woman alone, with no husband and no sons and no hired men, was considered a kind of madness by most of the people she spoke to. There are ranchers out there with big spreads who won't like a homesteader putting up fences, one old land agent told her, not unkindly, from behind his cluttered desk. Cattle country. The big outfits run their herds across the open range, and homesteaders, well, they're not always welcomed with open arms. I understand that, Anna said. Do you? Because it's not just unfriendly looks we're talking about. There have been incidents. I understand that, she said again, and something in her tone must have convinced him because he stopped arguing and sold her the claim papers. She hired a wagon and a driver named Abe Cutler, a wiry man of about 60 who chewed tobacco constantly and spoke in short, economical sentences. They traveled south for 2 days, through grassland that seemed to go on forever, past occasional homesteads and cattle camps, and once through a small town called Redfield that consisted of a general store, a smithy, and a church. And then they came to Barrow County, and Anna saw her land for the first time. It was, in the most honest terms, not much to look at. 160 acres of rolling grassland with a creek running along the eastern edge, a few scraggly cottonwood trees clustered near the water, and the remains of a previous settler's attempt. A collapsed lean-to, and a section of fence that had fallen over and been reclaimed by the grass. The land was flat in some places and gently rolling in others. The summer grass was golden and dry. The sky was enormous. She stood on it for a long time, just standing, feeling the wind come across the prairie and move through her hair, and she thought, "This is mine, not Thomas's, not Gerald Finch's, not some creditor's. Mine," she said. "I'll take the lumber and the supplies from the wagon, Abe. Thank you for getting me here." Abe looked at her for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. "You sure about this?" "I have never been more sure of anything," she said, and she meant it. He helped her unload the lumber and the supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, a cast iron stove, tools, seed, everything she had calculated she would need to get through the winter, and then he drove away, and Anna Holloway was alone on her 160 acres of Kansas prairie with nothing but the wind and the sky and the absolute, terrifying freedom of it. She set to work. She was not a woman without skill. Growing up on her father's farm in Ohio had given her a practical education that her years as Thomas's wife had somewhat buried. She remembered how to work. She set up a canvas tent from the supplies she had bought and began planning where the house would go. She had brought a book on building construction. It was a modest volume published in 1874 called The American Farmer's Building Guide, and she studied it in the evenings by lantern light with the same fierce concentration she had once given her school books. The work was punishing. She rose before dawn and worked until she could not see. She dug a proper fire pit. She hauled water from the creek. She began laying the foundation of what would become her house, working with wood and stone, her hands blistering and then hardening as the days went by. The summer heat was relentless, the kind of dry, pressing heat that was nothing like Ohio's humidity, but was no less exhausting for the difference. She had been on the land for 8 days when she first saw Eli Atkins. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of hooves, multiple horses coming from the north. She straightened up from where she had been digging, pushed the hair from her face, and watched 3 riders come across the grassland toward her. They rode at an easy pace, unhurried, the kind of pace that said they owned everything they were riding across, which, she realized with a tightening in her chest, was exactly how they thought about it. The man in front was, she would not deny it, even then, even standing there with blisters on her hands and righteous annoyance building in her chest, an arresting figure. He rode a big bay horse with the careless ease of a man who had been on horseback since before he could walk. He was tall, she could tell even from a distance, with broad shoulders, and the kind of lean, capable build that came from years of actual physical labor rather than any deliberate effort at it. He wore a dark hat pushed back on his head, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had dark eyes that she noticed from 20 feet away because they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He stopped his horse about 15 feet from where she was standing and looked at her, then at the supplies, then at the foundation she had begun to lay, and then back at her. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and level, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "Morning," she said. "I'm Eli Atkins. I run the AA ranch about 3 miles north of here." He paused. "This is my range. This is my land," she said. 160 acres, filed with the county land office in Dodge City. "I have the papers." Something moved in his expression. Not anger, not exactly. More like a man who had been expecting a manageable problem and was recalibrating. "I see," he said. "And you are Anna Holloway, Mrs. Holloway." "Yes." She did not elaborate. She watched him take in her black dress, the absence of any husband or hired hand, the evidence of work done by one pair of hands. One of the men behind him, a broad-shouldered fellow with a red beard, leaned over and said something to Eli in a low voice that she couldn't catch. Eli didn't respond to it, or not in any visible way. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I don't mean to be unwelcoming, but you should know that my cattle have been running across this land for 6 years. I'll need a clear path along the northern section for the drives." "Mr. Atkins," she said, "I have a legal claim to this land. I intend to farm it. Where I put my fences will be determined by what's best for my farm, not by what's most convenient for your cattle drives." He looked at her for another long moment. The red-bearded man behind him made a low sound that might have been amusement or might have been disapproval. She couldn't tell and didn't care. "All right," Eli Atkins said. "I expect we'll be talking again, Mrs. Holloway." "I expect we will," she said. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, and Anna watched him go and then turned back to her foundation with hands that were, she noticed, not entirely steady. Whether that was from the confrontation or from something else, she chose not to examine too closely. The first week after that encounter was quiet and she used it. She worked from first light until dark, and the house began to take shape, a single room to start, with a loft, built from the lumber she had brought supplemented by timber she found in the collapsed lean-to. The work was slow. There were days when she made a mistake and had to pull apart what she'd done and start again. And there were evenings when her body ached so deeply that she lay on her blankets on the ground inside the tent and stared at the canvas above her and thought about the photograph of her mother and the elm tree back in Ohio, and whether she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. But there were other evenings when she sat at the opening of her tent with a cup of coffee and watched the sun go down over the prairie in colors. She had no words for deep amber fading to rose fading to a violet so rich it seemed almost false, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself, not Thomas's wife, not the widow with the debts, not the woman who had trusted wrong. Just herself, Anna Holloway, alive and here and working towards something. In the second week she had a visitor who was not Eli Atkins. He arrived on a dusty horse at mid-morning, a heavy-set man in a good coat who introduced himself as Mr. Calvin Draper, representing the Barrow County Cattlemen's Association. "Lovely day," he said, not getting down from his horse. "Can I help you, Mr. Draper?" she asked. "I wanted to come by personally," he said, "to discuss the situation with your claim." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that was technically a smile but contained no warmth whatsoever, like a painted smile on a wooden face. "The association has a long history in this county, Mrs. Holloway. The members have invested substantially in this range. A homestead claim in the middle of prime cattle country creates certain complications." "My claim is legal," she said. "Oh, certainly, certainly. But legal and practical are two different things, aren't they?" He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "I'm authorized to offer you $250 for your claim as is, right now. That's a fair sum for a woman alone, starting over. You could go somewhere more settled." Anna felt the cold thing move through her again, the thing that had appeared at the auction and had been living in her chest ever since. She recognized it now for what it was. It was the place in her where fear had lived, and now something harder had moved in. $250, she said. "That's less than I paid for the claim." "The association values the goodwill of no," she said. "Thank you for riding out, Mr. Draper. Good day." His smile went away. What replaced it was not quite a threat, not in any specific language she could point to afterward, but it was something. a weight in his gaze, a tightening around his eyes. "Think carefully, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "The frontier can be a difficult place for someone without friends." He rode away, and Anna stood watching him until he was out of sight, and then she sat down on the raw wood of her half-built front step and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just breathing, just feeling the size of what she was up against. She was sitting like that, working herself back to steady, when she heard another horse approaching. She looked up, expecting Draper returning with a harder offer, and instead found Eli Atkins riding alone, without his men. He pulled up short when he saw her expression. Something shifted in his face. The guarded, assessing look she had seen during their first meeting cracked open slightly, like a door pushed ajar by wind. "You all right?" he asked. "Did you send him?" she demanded. "Draper from the Cattlemen's Association." "No," he said. He said it simply, without elaboration or defense, and she believed him. She wasn't sure why she believed him so quickly. Maybe it was the way he said it, without indignation, without the performance of innocence. Just a flat, level fact. "He offered me $250 for my claim," she said. Eli dismounted. He did it in one easy motion, the kind of thoughtless physical competence that she was beginning to associate with him, and he looped his reins over a fence post, one of the three she had managed to get in, and stood a few feet from her with his hat in his hands. "Draper doesn't speak for all of us," he said. "I want you to know that. But you are a member of the association." "I am. Doesn't mean I agree with every move they make." He looked at her house in progress for a moment. "You've done a lot in a short time," he said. "That's a solid foundation." She blinked. It was not what she had expected him to say. "Thank you. You do this work yourself?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. He was about 30, she thought. She would later learn he was 32, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work, but not harshly so, the kind of face that would stay handsome as it aged. He had a small scar along his jaw that she found herself noticing, and then feeling slightly embarrassed for having noticed. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to understand I'm not saying it to scare you or to push you off your claim. I'm saying it because I think you should know." "All right," she said. "Draper has done more than make offers to homesteaders in this county. 2 years ago, a family named Reeves filed a claim about 12 miles east of here. Their barn burned. Nobody proved anything, but everyone knew. They left." He looked at her directly. "The association has a dark side to it, Mrs. Holloway, and you are alone here." She held his gaze. "I know I am alone, Mr. Atkins. I have been alone since my husband died in February, and I have managed." "I don't doubt it." He paused. "I came to say, if you have trouble, if something happens that you can't handle alone, my ranch is 3 miles north. I have men there and I have resources. I'm not your enemy." She studied him for a long moment. This was a man she had argued with the first time she met him. A man who had told her his cattle had prior claim to her land. And now he was standing here with his hat in his hands telling her he wasn't her enemy, and she was trying to decide whether to believe that or whether it was a more sophisticated trap than Draper's blunt offer. "Why?" she asked. He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of the question. "Why what? Why would you help me? You want me off this land just as much as Draper does." "No," he said. "I want clear driving routes for my cattle. That's different from wanting you gone." He was quiet for a beat. "And what the association does, the burning, the threatening, I don't want any part of that. My father homesteaded this land before the association was powerful enough to bother anyone. I know what it is to build something from nothing." There was something in his voice when he said that, something that was not performance, not strategy, but the real weight of a real thing. Anna felt it, and she did not entirely know what to do with the feeling. "I appreciate the warning," she said carefully. "And the offer." He nodded, put his hat back on. "You need anything? I can send a man with some extra timber. I have more than I'm using from the spring." She nearly refused. She came within a breath of refusing. The independence she had claimed for herself felt fragile, easily bruised, and accepting help felt perilously close to beginning a debt she didn't know the terms of. But she was alone on the prairie with a half-built house and a threat that was not entirely idle, and she was not a fool. "Timber would be useful," she said. "I'll pay for it." "No need, I'll pay for it," she said firmly. Something that might have been a smile moved across his face. "All right," he said. "I'll send it tomorrow morning." He rode away, and Anna watched him go. And this time the unsteadiness in her hands was entirely different from what it had been the first time. The timber arrived the next morning as promised, brought by a young man named Petey who worked at the Double A and who helped her unload it and then, without being asked, helped her carry it to where she was building and then stood around in the way of someone who has energy to spend and doesn't know what to do with it. "You working alone?" he asked. "Obviously," she said. He picked up a hammer. "I could help. Mr. Atkins said I could spend the morning here if you needed." She looked at him. He was young, maybe 20, 21, with a cheerful, open face and enormous hands that knew what to do with a hammer. She thought about her aching back and the 4 walls that were not yet standing. "I would be grateful," she said. With Petey's help, she had the walls of the single room up by the end of that day. It was extraordinary, the difference another pair of strong hands made. They worked well together, communicating in the practical shorthand of people engaged in a physical task, and by afternoon she found herself laughing at something Petey said. She couldn't recall afterward what it was, something about a particularly stubborn wall post, and the laugh surprised her. She hadn't laughed in months. It felt strange, like a muscle she had forgotten she had. That evening, after Petey had ridden back to the Double A, Anna stood inside her 4 walls, open to the sky above where the roof would go, and felt something expand in her chest that she recognized as something dangerous and tender. Hope. She was feeling hope. She walked the 3 miles to the Double A 2 days later to return Petey's help with a jar of the preserved peaches she had brought from Ohio and hadn't yet opened. She was not going to pretend that the peaches were the only reason she went. She was not going to pretend she wasn't hoping to see Eli Atkins. She went anyway. The Double A was a working ranch, and it looked it busy and purposeful, with a large main house, several outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and the constant movement of men and animals going about the business of cattle ranching. It was a big operation, she realized, bigger than she had understood from a distance. She found Eli at the corral, working with a young horse that was not entirely convinced about being ridden. He was patient with it in a way that was interesting to watch, not forcing, not backing down, just steady and consistent, offering the horse a choice while making it clear which choice was better. When he saw her walking across the yard, he handed off the horse to one of the ranch hands and came over, and she noticed that he did not bother to school his expression before she could see it. What was on his face when he saw her coming was unguarded, open, like the look a person gets before they remember they are being watched. She gave him the peaches. He thanked her for them. They stood at the corral fence and talked for almost an hour, and she was not sure how it happened, how a conversation about timber and fence placement became a conversation about where they had each come from, about what the frontier meant to them, about the dark reality of what homesteaders faced in cattle country and what he thought could and should be done about it. He was, she discovered, a complicated man. He was not the simple cattle baron she had expected. He had feelings about the homesteading conflict that were not entirely in line with the association's position. Feelings he kept quiet publicly, because the association's political power was not something to antagonize without good reason. But that came out in private conversation with a clarity and a passion that surprised her. "My father came here in 1856, he told her. "He built this ranch from 160 acres, same as you're doing. 30 years later, the men who talk about open range rights are the men who fenced theirs in first. There's a dishonesty in it that I can't stomach. But you're a member of the association," she said. "I am. Because being outside it entirely means they work against you instead of around you." He paused. "It's not a position I'm proud of." "At least you know that," she said. He looked at her sidelong and she felt the weight of that look all the way down her spine. "You're remarkably direct," he said. I spent 12 years being careful about what I said, she told him. I'm done with that. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she had been too blunt, had pushed past some invisible line. But what he said was, "Tell me about the 12 years." She did not tell him everything. She told him about the farm and about Thomas and about the debts, and she told him about the grave under the elm tree and about selling every last thing she owned to buy a ticket west. And she told him about standing at the auction and watching 12 years of her life go for $320. She told him more than she had intended to tell anyone, more than she had told Mrs. Carver at the boarding house, more than she had written in the letter she sent to her sister in Cincinnati. He listened. He did not interrupt, and he did not offer comfort in the way that felt like a dismissal, the there kind of comfort that really meant, please stop making me feel uncomfortable with your grief. He just listened with his arms resting on the corral fence and his eyes on the horses, and when she was done he said, "That took more courage than most people have. Selling everything, starting over. Most people would have found something to go back to. You went forward." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going golden across the corrals, and the air smelled of hay and horse and the dry Kansas grass, and she thought, I am in danger. Not the kind Draper represented, not the barn-burning kind. A different kind entirely. She went home to her half-built house and spent the evening thinking about things that were not what she ought to be thinking about. The roof went on in the third week, and this time Eli himself came to help, arriving in the morning with Petey and 2 other men from the AA, and they had her roof framed, covered, and weather-tight by sundown. It was not a large house. 1 room on the ground floor with a sleeping loft above. A small front porch she had insisted on because she wanted somewhere to sit and watch the prairie evenings, but it was solid, and it was hers. And when they were done and the last light of the day was fading, and she had made coffee on the cast iron stove that was the first piece of furniture in her home, she stood on her front porch with a cup in her hands and felt something so enormous and so good that it almost frightened her. Eli stood beside her on the porch. His men had ridden back to the AA, but he had lingered. She had not asked him to linger, and he had not made a production of it. He had just stayed, helping with the last small details, and then stood here, and here they were. "It's a good house," he said. "It is," she agreed. The prairie stretched out before them in the evening quiet, the grass moving in the breeze, the first stars appearing in the deepening sky. A coyote called somewhere to the south, that lonesome, rolling sound that she had found eerie when she first heard it and had come to find beautiful. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "You can ask," she said. Do you intend to stay, for good, or is this is where I live now," she said. "This is my life, there is nothing to go back to." He nodded slowly. She could feel the weight of what he was not saying, the thing that was building between them that had no name yet, that was too new and too vulnerable to name. "There's a harvest social in Redfield in September," he said. "If you'd be willing, it would be a chance for you to meet the other settlers in the area. There are more homesteaders out here than the association would like anyone to know." "I would like that," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she did not look away. The look lasted 2 or 3 seconds, which is a very long time when 2 people are standing close together in the evening and the whole prairie is laid out around them and there is nothing in the world between their eyes. "Good night, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Anna," she said. "Please call me Anna." A pause. "Good night, Anna." "Good night, Eli." She watched him ride away into the darkness and then went inside and sat by her stove and tried to read her building guide and read the same page 4 times without retaining a word of it. August in Kansas was a lesson in endurance. The heat was a physical presence, something you moved through rather than against, dry and relentless. Anna worked her land, breaking ground for a kitchen garden that would not produce until next year but needed to be started now, digging irrigation channels from the creek, mending the fences she was slowly putting up around her acreage. She was building a life from scratch, and there were days when the sheer scale of what she had undertaken pressed down on her like a physical weight. She saw Eli regularly now. He would ride by her claim most mornings, ostensibly to check on his northern fence line, and they had fallen into a habit of sharing a cup of coffee before he went on his way. The conversations ranged widely. She told him about Ohio, about her childhood, about her father who had been a Methodist minister and a farmer both. He told her about growing up on the same land, about learning to ride before he could read, about the father he had lost to a fever when Eli was 21, and the ranch he had inherited not fully made and had spent the subsequent 11 years completing. He told her once, in a morning conversation that went longer than usual, about a woman he had been engaged to 7 years earlier, a woman named Clara who had come from Kansas City and had spent 2 seasons on the ranch before deciding that the frontier was not, as she had imagined, romantic. That it was in fact difficult and isolated and unglamorous, and that she was not willing to trade the life she knew for it. "I understood," he said. "It's not for everyone." "Did it hurt?" Anna asked. "Yes," he said simply. For a long time, he looked at her over his coffee cup. "It changes what you look for afterward. You stop looking for someone who thinks they might like this life, and you start looking for someone who already knows what it is and chooses it anyway." She held his gaze. "And have you found that?" she asked, and then immediately felt the heat rise in her face because that was the most forward thing she had said to anyone in years, possibly in her entire adult life. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it did something to his face that she was not prepared for. It took the weathered gravity out of it and replaced it with something warm and young and slightly devastating. "I'm working on it," he said. She looked away and drank her coffee and felt happiness moving through her like sunlight, cautious and bright and warm. The trouble came in the first week of August, as she had always known it would. She came home from the creek one afternoon to find one of her fence sections pulled down, not fallen, but deliberately pulled, the posts yanked from the ground and the wire cut. The damage was to the section nearest the northern boundary, the section Eli had asked her about on that first day. She stood looking at it for a long time, and the old cold thing moved through her chest. She repaired the fence the next morning. It was harder work alone, the posts were heavy, the ground was unyielding, and it took most of the day. 2 days later, she found it pulled down again, this time in 2 sections. On the third occurrence, she rode to the AA. She found Eli in his office, a room at the back of the main house that was full of ledgers and land maps and the practical paperwork of running a large ranch. He looked up when she was shown in by one of his men, and he read her expression in the first second. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, there was something in his face that she recognized now, the careful control of anger. He was angry on her behalf, and he was keeping it contained, but it was there, hot and real, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands on the desk. "Draper," he said. "I can't prove it," she said. "But yes." "I'll call for a meeting with the association," he said. "This stops." "Eli," she leaned forward slightly. "Calling a meeting doesn't guarantee it stops. Anything, it confirms to Draper that it's working, that it's getting to you." He looked at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that the best response is to keep building, keep the fence up, be visible and steady and impossible to discourage. And I'm suggesting," she paused, chose her words, "that having a friend with a large ranch 3 miles north might be more useful as a visible, ongoing fact than as an emergency resource." Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "A friend," he said. "Or whatever the right word is," she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. The silence between them was approximately 3 heartbeats long. "All right," he said. "I'll ride your fence line with you once a week. My men will be seen on your land, and I will also call a meeting with the association because I'm not going to watch Draper think he can do this to anyone and have no response." "Thank you," she said. "Anna," he said her name quietly, the way people say names when names mean something. "Whatever the right word is, I am not indifferent to what happens to you. I want you to know that." She had to take a breath. "I know," she said. "I'm not indifferent either." He stood up from behind the desk and she stood from her chair, and they were closer than she had realized, both of them having leaned in during the conversation, and for a moment the room was very still and very full. She stepped back. It was not the right moment. There was too much unresolved between them, too much danger still circling, too much that needed to be settled before she allowed herself to want what she was beginning to very clearly want. "I'll ride back and repair the fence," she said. "I'll come with you," he said. They repaired the fence together that afternoon, and when they were done, sweating and covered in the red Kansas dust, he handed her the water canteen without being asked, and she drank from it and handed it back. And the easiness of that exchange, the simple, unthinking intimacy of it, hit her somewhere below the chest. The Redfield Harvest Social in late September was Anna's first real entry into the wider community of the county, and it was not what she had expected. She had expected something like the church socials back in Ohio, sedate, organized, slightly stiff. What she found instead was a full-on celebration, held in and around the Redfield General Store and spilling out into the main street, with fiddle music and dancing and tables crowded with food brought by every family within riding distance. There were more homesteaders in Barrow County than she had realized, dozens of families, most of them struggling, most of them watching the fence line conflict with the cattle ranchers with the kind of anxious attention you give to a coming storm. She went with Eli. They did not discuss whether they were going together. It simply resolved itself that way, as things between them had begun to resolve themselves, naturally and without a great deal of deliberation. He arrived at her place in the late afternoon with a wagon, because she had made 3 pies for the social and could not carry them on horseback, and she came out in a blue dress that was not the black morning dress and was the first non-black thing she had worn since February, and she watched his face when he saw her, and what she saw there made her feel bold and warm and alive. "That's a good color," he said. "Thank you," she said. They drove to Redfield in the late afternoon light, and she noticed things, the way his shoulder was close to hers on the wagon seat, the way his hands held the reins, the way he laughed at something she said, a full, unguarded laugh, and it was a good laugh, the kind that meant something real. At the social, she met the other homesteaders. She met the Henderson family, a couple her own age with 4 children, who had been on their claim for 3 years, and had survived everything the association had thrown at them by virtue of sheer stubbornness. She met a widow named Grace Carmichael who had come west on her own 2 years earlier, and had proved up her claim, and was now raising chickens and a small herd of dairy cattle, and was one of the most quietly formidable women Anna had ever met. She met them and she talked with them and she ate her own pie and danced twice, once with Petey, who was very enthusiastic but only moderately skilled, and once with Eli, who danced the way he did everything else, with a calm, unhurried competence that made it effortless. Dancing with him was something she was not prepared for. It was a waltz, the fiddle player, a thin man named Jim Dodd who apparently knew an enormous number of songs, launched into something slow and melodic, and Eli's hand was at the small of her back and her hand was in his, and they moved through it together, and she was aware of nothing else in the room, or the street, or the county. The world narrowed to the space between them, and she thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it not as a revelation, but as an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a thing that has been true for a while. Afterward, when they drove home under a sky full of stars, she sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence from any they had shared before. It was the silence of 2 people who know something has shifted, who can feel it in the air, who are perhaps waiting for one of them to say it first. He stopped the wagon at her gate. She gathered the empty pie dishes from the wagon bed. He tied off the reins and helped her down, and when her feet were on the ground, he held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I had a good evening," she said. "So did I," he said. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the particular warmth in his dark eyes, the way they were looking at her with an openness that was almost aching. "Eli," she said. "Anna," he said simultaneously. They both stopped, a beat of silence, And then they both laughed quietly, and the laughter broke the tension, and she held his hand and said, "I think you know." "I think I do," he said. "I've been trying to be patient because I didn't want to. I didn't want to be something you felt complicated by, given everything you've been through." "You are complicated," she said, "but not in the way you mean." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was both old-fashioned and exactly right, and she felt it everywhere. "Then I'll stop being patient," he said. "That seems wise," she said. He smiled. She smiled. The prairie night was enormous and bright around them, the stars impossibly near, and she stood at her gate and watched him drive away, and then went inside and sat on her bed in the dark and pressed her hand to her own heart and felt it beating fast and steady and alive. October brought the first cold and also brought the confrontation she had known was coming. She was at the general store in Redfield, buying winter supplies, when Calvin Draper came in. He did not pretend the meeting was accidental. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, positioning himself between her and the door in a way that was technically open to interpretation, but was clearly deliberate. "I hear you've been spending considerable time with Eli Atkins." "That's not your business, Mr. Draper," she said. "It is my business when it affects the association's interests," he said. "Atkins has been causing problems at our meetings, raising issues about homesteader rights that don't need to be raised. Certain people are wondering if he's had some personal motivation to go soft on the fence question." She looked at him steadily. "I imagine if Eli Atkins has changed his position on any issue, it's because he has reasons for doing so. He's a thoughtful man." "He's a man who should remember where his loyalties lie," Draper said. "And you should remember that your claim is on land that has been used by this county's ranchers for 20 years. There are ways to make that claim very difficult to hold on to." "Are you threatening me?" she said. He stepped back, all smooth reasonableness. "Of course not. I'm offering you information. The frontier can be unpredictable. Things happen. Nobody can protect everyone from everything." She bought her supplies. She rode home. And then she rode to the AA and told Eli exactly what Draper had said, word for word, because she had committed it to memory. Eli's face went through several things very quickly while she was talking. By the time she finished, it had settled into something quiet and absolutely resolved. "He won't do anything overt," Eli said. "He's too careful for that, but I'm not going to wait for the next incident." He looked at her. "I'm going to the county judge in Dodge City. I'm going to lay out what Draper has done, the fence cutting, the Reeves barn, what he said to you today, and I'm going to request a formal hearing. If we can get enough settlers to testify." "Grace Carmichael will testify," Anna said immediately. "The Hendersons will. I've talked to them. And I'll put up the money for a lawyer," he said. She opened her mouth to object. The question of debt and obligation between them was one she had been careful about, but he shook his head. "Not as a loan," he said. "Not as something between you and me. As a matter of right. Draper has been doing this for years, and someone should have stopped him years ago, and they didn't because nobody could afford to fight him. I can afford to fight him. That's what I'm going to do." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not performing generosity, not signaling his resources or his power. He was simply stating what he intended to do because he thought it was right, with the uncomplicated directness of a man who did not make a great performance of his principles but had them nonetheless. "All right," she said. "Anna." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I'm not going to let you regret coming here. I want you to know that." "I don't regret it," she said. She turned her hand in his, palm to palm. "Not a single day of it." He kissed her then for the first time, with his hands framing her face and her hands at his chest. And it was a kiss that was not tentative or exploratory but certain, the kiss of two people who have already been sure for some time and are finally closing the distance. When they separated, she pressed her forehead against his and said, "I have been wanting to do that since approximately the third day I knew you." His laugh was low and warm. "Only the third. I was hoping for the first. The first day you told me your cattle had rights to my land. I was very formal." "You were," she agreed, "and it didn't help at all." He laughed again, and she loved the sound of it, loved the easy warmth of being this close to him, loved the way his arms came around her and the way she fit there, not as if she had lost herself in him, but as if she had, for the first time in a very long time, found herself fully present in her own life. The legal process moved through November and into December, slow and complicated as legal processes always were. The lawyer Eli retained was a man named Edward Marsh, who came out from Dodge City and spent a week taking depositions from Anna, from the Hendersons, from Grace Carmichael, from two other homesteaders who had faced association pressure. Eli testified about what he had witnessed and heard. Petey testified about the fence posts he had seen pulled from the ground on his morning rides. Draper's lawyer was better paid and tried every angle. He argued that the fence cutting could not be attributed to any association member, that Draper's conversations with Anna and others were merely friendly business discussions, that homesteaders were notoriously careless about their own fences and tended to blame others for their own negligence. The hearing was held in Dodge City in December, before Judge Henry Alcott, who was a man in his 60s with white whiskers and the kind of face that was hard to read. Anna sat in the courtroom and gave her testimony in a clear, level voice, and watched Draper watching her from across the room with an expression that was meant to be intimidating and was, a little, but not enough to change anything she said. Judge Alcott took 2 days to deliberate and returned with a ruling that the association's members had engaged in a pattern of intimidation against homestead claimants, that such actions were in violation of the Homestead Act and Kansas territorial law, and that a fine would be levied against the association and a permanent injunction issued against interference with legally filed homestead claims. It was not a perfect victory. The fine was not enormous. Draper would not serve any time, but the injunction was real, and the public nature of the ruling changed something in Barrow County, changed what the association could do openly, changed the calculation for other homesteaders, changed the sense of what was possible. Anna walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air of Dodge City and stood on the wooden sidewalk and exhaled a long, slow breath that turned to mist in the cold. Eli came to stand beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I can breathe," she said. He took her hand right there on the main street of Dodge City in public, unhurried, and she let him. They had Christmas dinner at the AA, Anna and Eli and Petey, and the other ranch hands who had nowhere else to go, and Grace Carmichael, who had become Anna's closest friend in the county, and the Hendersons with their 4 children who filled the big dining room with noise and chaos, and made the whole thing feel like the kind of Christmas Anna had forgotten it was possible to have. She had put up a tree in her own house, a small cedar she had cut from the creek bank, and Eli had seen it when he came to bring her to the AA for dinner, and had stopped in the doorway of her little house and looked at it for a long moment, the tree with its single string of cranberries and the small collection of things she had made or found to put on it. And she had watched his face and seen something there that she thought was about more than a Christmas tree. It was about the house, the whole house, the proof of everything she had built. "You've made this into something," he said. "I have," she agreed. He looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" She said, though she had an idea because she had been thinking the same thing for weeks. "About what comes next," he said, "for both of us. For whether there's a way for what's here," he gestured between them, "to be what it clearly is." She waited. She had learned in 4 months of knowing him that Eli Atkins said the things he meant and only the things he meant, and that waiting for him to finish was always worth it. "I'm asking if you'd marry me," he said. "I'm asking plainly, because you've never wanted anything but plainness, and I think you deserve someone who doesn't make you guess." She looked at him for a moment, at the man in the doorway of her house that she had built with her own hands, the man who had helped her when she needed it and stood beside her without diminishing her, the man who had argued with her first and loved her after and would, she thought, keep doing both for the rest of their lives. "Yes," she said, without any hesitation. He crossed the room to her in 2 steps and lifted her off her feet, not in a showy way, just in the way of someone whose happiness is larger than their usual gravity, and she laughed against his shoulder and held on. They were married in the Redfield Church in February of 1879, exactly 1 year after Thomas had died and left her with nothing but debts and a newspaper clipping and an impossible choice. The church was small and cold, and everyone in Barrow County who could ride there was there, because the community that had been quietly growing through those months had grown to something real. Grace Carmichael stood up with Anna. Petey stood up with Eli. The preacher was a man named Pastor Willis, who had circuit-ridden through 3 counties for 20 years, and had seen enough frontier weddings to know when they were the real article. When he asked Anna if she took Eli Atkins as her husband, she said yes, and she said it with her whole voice. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just the clear, certain sound of a woman who knows exactly what she is choosing. Eli put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band that had come west from Missouri on his parents' wagon in 1856, and she wore it as the weight it was, not a debt, not an obligation, but a gift freely given. They stood on the steps of the Redfield Church in the February cold, and people threw rice and Grace Carmichael cried, and the Henderson children ran around their legs, and Petey looked tremendously pleased with himself. And Anna looked out over the frozen Kansas prairie and felt, in the very deepest place in her, something settle. Something that had been adrift since February of the year before, since the morning she found Thomas cold in their bed and the whole careful structure of the life she had built fell apart. It settled. It was home. She moved into the AA in March, but she kept her claim. That had been her one firm requirement, stated simply and accepted without argument. She kept her land. It would be part of what they were together, and in the summer she planted it in wheat. Eli helped her plow the first rows, and she walked behind the plow and turned the Kansas soil and felt it, the smell of it, the deep mineral richness, and thought of her father's farm in Ohio, thought of everything she had carried all this way, and planted it here in this new earth. The spring was good. The wheat came up green and strong, and the AA had a successful calving season, and the Barrow County homesteaders held their first formal meeting to organize a mutual aid society, which Anna had proposed, and which Eli had backed with the AA's resources. The world was not perfect, the association was still powerful. Draper had not become a gentle soul. The conflict between cattle and homestead interests was not resolved by one court ruling. These were the facts of the frontier, persistent and real. But the world was also better than it had been. More visible, more organized, more willing to push back. In May, Anna discovered she was pregnant. She told Eli in the evening after supper, sitting on the front porch of the main house, which was now her porch too, watching the prairie turn gold in the sunset. She said it simply, "I think we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment, and she watched his face with a closeness that came from months of learning him. What she saw was not fear, not the calculation of complication, but something that she could only describe as a great and uncomplicated joy, the kind that comes from wanting something and getting it in the fullest possible way. He put his arm around her and pulled her close against his side, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that as the last light went out of the sky and the coyotes started their evening conversation somewhere south and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas prairie. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "But that's all right. Fear means something matters." "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "I'm not brave," she said. "I was just not willing to stop." "That is the definition of brave," he said. She thought about that. She thought about Thomas and the debts and the auction and the train west and the first sight of her land and the half-built house and the pulled fence posts and the courtroom and the wedding and the wheat coming up green. She thought about all the moments she had nearly stopped and didn't. "Maybe," she said. He kissed her temple. She closed her eyes. The night settled around them, warm and full. Their son was born in December of 1879, in the middle of a Kansas winter that was fierce and unrelenting. In the bedroom of the main house with Grace Carmichael, serving as midwife, and Eli sitting outside the door through 9 hours of labor, with the particular tortured patience of a man who is very capable in all circumstances, except this one. When Grace opened the door and told him he had a son, Anna heard him exhale in the hallway a long, shaking breath. And then he was in the room and beside her, and she watched him hold his son for the first time. This man who had built a ranch from the land his father left him, who had stood up in a courtroom against his own association, who had come to a stranger's half-built house and said, "I am not your enemy," and meant it. She watched him hold their son with those big, work-roughened hands as carefully as if the child were made of light. They named him James, after Eli's father, James Atkins, born in Kansas in the winter of 1879. The years that followed were not simple or easy, because nothing on the frontier was simple or easy. There were hard winters and lean years, and the ongoing friction of a changing territory moving toward statehood, with all the political and legal upheaval that entailed. There was a year when the wheat on Anna's land was largely lost to drought, and a year when a sickness moved through the cattle and took a portion of the double a herd. There were continued negotiations with the association, occasional flare-ups, moments where the old dangers threatened to revive. But through all of it, there was the bedrock of what they had built. Anna's land, her 160 acres along the creek, became known as the best wheat ground in Barrow County by 1882. She had studied soil and rotation and irrigation with the same fierce, methodical attention she had given the building guide in the first months, and it showed. Her wheat won a prize at the county fair in 1881, which gave her a satisfaction that was private and large, and had nothing to do with the prize money and everything to do with the proof of it. She also became the driving force behind the Barrow County Settlers' Aid Society, which by 1882 had 43 member families and a formal charter, and a small building in Redfield that served as a meeting hall and lending library. She and Grace Carmichael ran it together, and it was a real thing, a thing that helped people who were struggling, that connected isolated homesteaders to resources and legal information, and the simple, necessary knowledge that they were not alone. Eli, watching her, was not surprised. He had known from the morning he first rode up to her claim and found a woman building a house alone that she had something in her that was larger than circumstance. He thought about that first morning often, in the way you think about the moments that turned everything. He had ridden up expecting to manage a problem and found instead the person who would change his life. He said this to her once, on a warm evening in the summer of 1882, sitting on the porch of the main house with James, who was 2.5 and enormously energetic, asleep finally inside, and the prairie evening doing what it always did, making everything feel both very small and very large at the same time. "What did you expect?" she asked, curious. "Someone I could talk out of it," he said, "or talk to reason with, make it easy. And instead you told me your claim was legal and your fences were your business, and I rode home and thought about it all evening." He smiled. "Petey said I was distracted at supper. He was right," she laughed. "I was terrified that morning. You didn't show it. That's the trick," she said. "My mother used to say, if you can't stop being afraid, at least stand up straight." He reached across and took her hand. She looked at their joined hands, his large and dark from the sun, her smaller but no less capable, no less marked by work. "I want you to know something," he said, "and I want you to really hear it." She looked at him. "I'm listening. What you did coming here, starting over, building everything from nothing, you didn't just change your own life. You changed the county. You changed what's possible for every family that came after you and didn't face the association alone because the society exists." He paused. "And you changed me. You made me better at being honest about what I believed instead of just convenient about it." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of what he was saying. "You made it possible," she said finally. "You showed up on that first day and told me you weren't my enemy, and you meant it, and that was everything. That was—" She stopped, looked out at the prairie evening. "I had been trying to do it all alone because I didn't know if there was anyone I could trust, and you were just there, being trustworthy without being asked to be. I learned it from my father, he said. He said the measure of a man is what he does when there's no profit in doing right. He was right, she said. James called from inside, not crying, just the vocalization of a child who has woken up and is conducting a census of the household. And they both looked toward the house and then at each other. "I'll get him," Eli said, and stood, and she watched him go inside and heard his voice, low and warm, talking to their son and the small domestic sounds of a man lifting a child and settling him. She turned back to the prairie. The stars were coming out, the same stars she had stared at through the opening of her tent on her first nights on her land, when everything had been uncertain and the darkness had felt very large. They were the same stars. She was not the same woman. She was Anna Atkins now, née Holloway, 31 years old, farmer and board chair of the Settlers' Aid Society and wife and mother, resident of Barrow County, Kansas, which was not the most beautiful or the most comfortable or the most civilized place in the world, but was hers, irrevocably and entirely hers, built from what she had carried here, and what she had found here, and what had grown between them. Eli came back out with James on his hip, the boy heavy-eyed but awake, looking at the sky with the serious attention very small children give to things they don't have words for yet. "Stars," Anna said to him, pointing. He pointed too, imitating her, and said something that was not quite the word but was reaching for it. "Stars," Eli agreed. They sat together on the porch of the AA, the three of them, while the Kansas night settled in around them. James fell asleep between them on the porch bench, a hand on each of their thighs, and they let him sleep there because the night was warm and there was no rush. A great horned owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek to the south, and the grass moved in the wind, and very far away, the coyotes began their conversation. Anna thought about the auction in Millhaven. She thought about the moment the hammer came down and the sum was named, $320, and how the world had felt like the end of something. She had not known, standing there in that crowd in her black dress with her white knuckles and her cold chest, that the end of something is always the beginning of something else. She had not known that the place she was going to was not exile but arrival. She had not known that the man who would challenge her first and love her after and stand beside her through everything the frontier could throw at two people was already 3 miles north, running his cattle across land that would become, in the most essential sense, hers. She knew it now. She knew it in the solidity of her husband beside her and the weight of her sleeping son between them and the sound of the Kansas night, and in the particular peace that had settled into her bones over the last 3.5 years, not the peace of having nothing left to fight for, but the peace of knowing you have built something true. She had sold everything to start over west. The man sitting beside her had made absolutely certain she never regretted it. In the spring of 1884, Anna and Eli welcomed their second child, a daughter this time, which Eli received with a joy equal to what he had felt at James's birth, and which prompted James, who was 4 and deeply interested in his own position in the world, to spend several days assessing whether this was a welcome development before deciding that it was, largely because the baby could not yet walk or talk, and therefore represented no meaningful competition. They named her Clara, not after Eli's former fiancée, that would have been strange, but after Anna's mother, whose photograph still sat on the dresser in the bedroom, the only thing Anna had carried all the way from Ohio that was not a document or a piece of clothing. Clara Atkins, born in the spring of 1884, who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, and who was, from the very first hours, entirely herself. Grace Carmichael stood godmother. Petey, who had in the intervening years met and married a woman named Sarah from the Henderson family's extended relations, and was now running a small homestead of his own in Barrow County, stood godfather. The Redfield Church had been extended by 1884. The congregation had grown, as the county's population had grown, and the ceremony was warm and full, and everything a ceremony should be. Anna stood at the front of that church with Eli and their children, and felt the whole trajectory of it. The farm in Ohio and the auction, and the train and the tent, and the half-built house, and the first confrontation and the coffee shared at first light, and the dance in Redfield and the kiss, and the wedding, and the courtroom, and the wheat and James, and now Clara. She felt the whole of it as a continuous thing, each piece connected to the last, each choice leading to the next, all of it adding up to this room and these people and this man beside her. She had not known when she bought that one-way ticket what she was buying. She had thought she was buying an escape, a chance to stop losing. She had been buying something much better than that. She had been buying a beginning. Calvin Draper retired from the Cattlemen's Association in 1883, under circumstances that were not fully explained in public, but that several people with knowledge of county politics understood to involve the ongoing legal pressure from Judge Alcott's 1878 ruling and its subsequent reinforcements. He sold his holdings to a younger man who had fewer opinions about homesteaders and more interest in the practical reality that the territory was moving toward statehood and the old open-range days were ending. Kansas became a state in 1861, but Barrow County's particular struggles with the transition from range to settled territory played out over the whole subsequent decade. By 1884, the landscape of it had changed visibly: more homesteads, more fences, more farms breaking the grassland into ordered sections. Anna had complicated feelings about this, because she was one of the people who had helped bring it about, and she understood that the prairie they were turning into farmland had its own life, its own beauty, its own logic, and that the turning of it was not an uncomplicated good. She talked about this with Eli, and the conversations were among the most interesting they had. He had a rancher's perspective on the land, the grass, the water, the movement of cattle through a landscape that was different from her farmer's perspective, and the intersection of the two views produced something she thought was closer to the truth than either alone. "My father used to say," Eli told her once, "that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it for a little while, and what we owe it is care." She kept that thought. She planted trees along the creek bank, native cottonwoods and a few elms that reminded her, in a complicated way, of the elm back in Ohio. She maintained a section of her land as unbroken prairie, a deliberate choice, a place where the original grass and its attendant life could simply be. Eli did the same on a larger section of the Double-A. It was a small thing, against the scale of what was changing, but it was something. In 1885, the Settlers' Aid Society of Barrow County achieved its most significant political moment when it submitted a formal petition to the Kansas state legislature advocating for legal protections for homesteaders against forced sale and intimidation. The petition was signed by 97 families. Anna had drafted most of the language herself, with help from Edward Marsh, the lawyer who had handled the original Draper case. The petition did not immediately become law. These things rarely did immediately, but it was entered into the legislative record and debated, and a modified version of its core protections was incorporated into a state statute in 1887. Anna heard about it in a letter from Marsh and read the letter twice at the kitchen table of the Double-A, and then folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box where she kept the important papers, next to the original land claim and the wedding certificate and her mother's photograph. Eli came in from the corrals and found her sitting there. "Good news," he said, reading her face. "Yes," she said, "come here." She told him about the letter, and he read it, and he set it down on the table and looked at her with an expression that was so full and so uncomplicated in its pride that she had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much. "You did that," he said. "We did that. The society did that. The families who testified did that. You started it," he said. "You came here with nothing and you built it." She thought of the newspaper clipping, soft with folding. She thought of the auctioneer's voice. She thought of standing at the train station in Millhaven with a carpetbag and $320 and a choice between forward and backward. "I had help," she said, "from the very beginning." He came around the table and sat beside her and took her hand. And James, who was 5 now and entirely in possession of the kitchen, in the way that 5-year-olds are entirely in possession of every space they occupy, came in from wherever he had been and climbed up between them and looked at the letter with great seriousness, and announced that he could read the word Kansas in it. "So you can," Anna said, and Clara, just over a year old and watching everything from the small chair near the window where she had been set down, gave a sound that seemed to indicate her opinion of the matter was favorable. The double A grew through the late 1880s in ways that reflected both the work they put into it and the changing realities of Kansas cattle ranching. The great trail drives were ending, the railheads were reaching further into the territory, the ranges were fencing in, the economics of the business were shifting. Eli adapted, as he adapted to most things, by thinking it through carefully and making choices that were about the long term rather than the immediate. He brought in better breeding stock, shifted toward a smaller, higher quality herd rather than the massive drives of the open range era. He worked with Anna on integrating the wheat operation on her land with the ranch's broader operations, so that the 200 acres of Holloway wheat became part of what the double A was rather than a separate, parallel enterprise. The combination was successful. By the end of the decade, the double A was one of the most productive operations in Barrow County, notable for running both cattle and grain, and for the somewhat unusual fact that its co-owner was a woman whose name appeared on the deed alongside her husband's. Anna had insisted on that too. The deed, she had brought it up in the first year of their marriage, in the plain, direct way she brought up everything that mattered. "I want my name on the property," she had said. "Of course," he had said, as if it were obvious, which made her realize she had slightly underestimated him and also loved him even more for making it obvious. The children grew. James, by 10, was already spending his mornings at the corrals with Eli, with the concentrated attention of a boy who intends to know everything about horses and will not be satisfied until he does. He had his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness, and a particular quality of his own that was harder to name, a kind of ethical clarity, a sense of fairness that he seemed to have arrived with rather than been taught. When something was wrong, James noticed it and said so, regardless of whether it was convenient to notice. Anna watched this in her son with a feeling she recognized as the best kind of pride. Not the pride of a parent in a child's achievement, but the pride of recognizing a person, a real and particular person, coming into themselves. Clara was different. Where James was deliberate and steady, Clara was quick and wide-ranging, interested in everything, conducting her own investigation of the world with an energy that was exhausting and magnificent. She was, by 5, capable of talking to any adult who visited the double A for longer than they had planned to talk, asking questions with the relentless precision of someone who genuinely wants all the answers. "She's going to be a lawyer," Grace Carmichael said one afternoon, after Clara had spent 20 minutes interrogating her about the legal rights of women in Kansas. "God willing," Anna said, and meant it. In the autumn of 1888, Anna stood on the porch of the double A, her porch, their porch, the porch she had come to know in every season and every weather, and watched the sunset over the Kansas prairie with the particular quality of attention she had learned to give it. Not the anxious attention of her first months when she was always calculating risk, always watching for threat. The easeful attention of a person at home. 10 years. It had been 10 years since she stepped off a train in Dodge City with a carpetbag and $320 and a piece of a newspaper folded into 8 pieces in her pocket. 10 years since she had stood on her land for the first time and felt it, mine, Eli came out and stood behind her, his arms coming around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head in the way he had, and she leaned back against him and felt the familiar, steadying warmth of him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the auction," she said. "About the morning I got on the train." He was quiet, listening. "I think about the version of me that didn't get on it," she said. "The version that found something to go back to. I think about her sometimes." "Where do you think she is?" "I don't know, somewhere smaller, somewhere," she paused, finding the words. "Somewhere she never found out what she could do." His arms tightened around her. "I'm glad you got on the train," he said. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The stars were coming out over Kansas, and the grass was moving in the wind. And somewhere across the prairie, the coyotes were beginning their evening, and James was doing something noisy in the barn. And Clara's voice came from inside the house, singing a song she had invented herself that had no particular tune but enormous enthusiasm. And the world was so full of good things that Anna could not hold them all at once but could feel them all, present and real and hers. She had sold everything to start over west. She had stood at the absolute end of one life and chosen to begin another, alone, with almost nothing, in a direction that nobody around her thought was wise. The rancher had made sure she never regretted it, not by protecting her from difficulty, or by taking over what she was doing, or by making himself necessary in ways that diminished her, but by showing up and meaning what he said and being the kind of man who could stand next to a woman who was building something and build with her without believing it was about him, by being someone worth trusting in a life where she had trusted wrong, by choosing her as fully as she had chosen him. That was all it had taken, all it ever took. Two people willing to be honest about what they wanted and brave enough to reach for it, in the middle of a vast and beautiful and indifferent prairie that gave nothing away for free but gave everything to those who were willing to work for it. Anna Atkins stood on her porch in the October evening and felt the sum of it. All those years, all that work, all that love, and it was more than she had known to hope for on the morning she stood at the auction and heard the hammer come down. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.